This is the TSG Multimedia Podcast for September of 2021. We're sponsored this month by Podomatic and the TSG Train Crew on Patreon. Thank you very much. I'm your host, John Abaticola, just off the most epic road trip I've ever been on. I'll get to that later. I have some updates from last month, information about upcoming programs here on the channel, responses to viewer comments, and some cool catches in our Catch of the Month segment. Now before we get to all that, hit the thumbs up icon if you like the programs on this channel. Leaving a comment in the comment section below also helps me know if you like what I'm doing here. I want to take a second to mention that you can help support my work by becoming a part of the TSG Train Crew. That's what I call our supporters on Patreon. It's as cheap as $2 a month, and it helps me bring the content you enjoy to the channel. You can also get yourself some branded merchandise by clicking on the links just below the video player on your computer screen. We have t-shirts, coffee mugs, phone cases, whatever you want to show the world that you're one of the best viewers on YouTube when you go out chasing trains. I talk about the events of the month on every podcast to give you an idea of what programs are being developed for future release. This month is no exception, and it was a doozy. August was insanely busy, and the second half of the month was spent on the road, completing a 7-state, 3,800-mile trek that included various stops for all of the things I cover on this channel: prototype rail fanning, model railroading, and historic preservation. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. If you saw the podcast last month, you may remember I mentioned that my friend Robin wanted to share the McKean car project that he's been working on. Well, we recorded for that program on the 4th of August. The video we made will be coming out pretty soon, and I'm sure you'll like it. On the 7th, Sydney and I went and joined the Rails by the Bay Planning Committee for a private excursion on the narrow gauge railroad at Ardenwood. Thanks to Don Morenzi and the SPCRR crew for this great event. This event was organized by the Planning Committee, and I have to say it was quite a nice gesture that we appreciated a lot. On Friday the 13th, I went to Roaring Camp to ride the beach train. It was my friend Trevor's last day as a conductor before returning to school, so he invited a few of us as guests to enjoy the ride. I met up with Murph, Paul Nolan, and Curtis Hill, who was there to ride with Kevin, who was the engineer for the day. We had a great time riding the train and hanging out together. It was Murph's first time ever on the beach train, so I asked him to appear on screen to talk about his impression of the ride. Let's take a look.
It was a really great run. Had a nice time. Learned a little bit about both the trees and the equipment and that kind of stuff. Trevor does an amazing job of explaining it all. I can't imagine doing that day after day, but he manages to keep the energy up in it too. And it was great going on down to the boardwalk and that, and without having to drive Highway 9. So everything was wonderful.
On the 18th, I set out on a truly epic road trip. The first part of the trip was going to Sacramento, where I met up with train crew member Goofy Gary. We arrived in Truckee just in time to see Amtrak Train 5, the westbound Zephyr. We ended our day in Elko, where we found some train action at the Union Pacific Yard. The next day, we drove out to Salt Lake City, arriving just in time for Shakalaka bro Alvin to get off work and score some legit pizza with some friends at his place. Alvin got some expert advice for the layout he's in the process of building as well. On the 20th, we drove to Evanston, Wyoming to document the Fremo N record-breaking layout. This event was the motivation for our trip, as I was invited to document it a few months ago. It was a private event that included something like 200 modules and people from several states. Sorry, I don't remember all the exact numbers at this moment, but just know that it was the largest operating layout I've ever seen. Thanks for the invitation, guys. We had a great time documenting the event. The Fremo group had such a great time that they decided to do another big layout like this every 3 years. I hope I get to see the next one too. On the 21st, we headed east towards Cheyenne. We stopped briefly in Green River and caught some great action from a pedestrian overpass that offers a wide view of the UP yard there. We also stopped in Laramie before reaching Cheyenne. We went to the Cheyenne Depot and had an interesting encounter with the receptionist there, who was extremely rude and nasty. Thinking back on that makes me realize that we should have just left after her amazingly warm welcome, but we were determined not to let her ruin our day. After a whirlwind tour of the museum, we checked out the 4004 Big Boy in Holiday Park, and then went to Mike Panel's silo, where he and I documented some of his most recent projects. This was definitely a highlight, as I've been meaning to get back out there since 2019 when I first met Mike. We ended our day in Greeley, where we met up with Michelle and her esteemed sister Jennifer for dinner. On the 22nd, we went to the Colorado Model Railroad Museum. Gary had never been to the museum, so it was cool to be able to share it with him. While we were at it, I worked with Bob Pilk, one of the volunteers at the museum, to shoot some scenes and narration that I needed to finish the layout to our project I've had sitting on my archive drive for the past 2 years. We wrapped that up at about 1 so that we could drive out to the Colorado Railroad Museum with Chris Palomares, who met us in Greeley. We had a great time looking at the displays in Golden, and then went with Chris to Denver Union Station for some train watching and dinner. Thanks for taking time out to hang out with us, Chris. It's greatly appreciated. The next day, Michelle took us on an excellent chasing trains adventure in and around the Denver area. We had a chance to meet her friend Brad Swartzwelter, who's a conductor on the Zephyr between Grand Junction and Denver. He also owns a home on the bluff overlooking something called Big Ten Curve. This curve was built to provide a suitable grade for the railroad, and it spans a huge amount of space that's all visible from Brad's backyard. Just as we were about to leave, we heard a train horn and ended up getting to watch a freight train traverse the entire curve. It took something like 12 minutes, but we caught the whole thing. That was really awesome. I asked Brad to explain what Big Ten Curve is, so let's take a look.
Hello, I'm Brad Swartzwelter. I'm a conductor for Amtrak, and I live up here on East Ridge, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the track that you can see from my home here above the Big Ten on the top of East Ridge, up above the fire clay siding, as it was originally named in 1900 by David Moffett and A.J. Sumner, his primary engineer that laid out the Denver and Salt Lake Railroad. And then that eventually became the Rio Grande, that eventually became the Southern Pacific, that eventually became absorbed into the conglomerate Union Pacific Railroad. And you can see it here, it's a stunning piece of track. It's called the Big Ten Curves, named for several reasons, but most likely it was named the Big Ten and the Little Ten because there are 2 sets of 10-degree curves, to my left and then out to the right. And these curves were necessary to gain altitude to make it up to the Continental Divide. At the time that it was originally sited, they crossed the Continental Divide over Rawlins Pass at 11,662 feet above sea level. Then, in 1928, the Moffett Tunnel opened, lowering the apex of the railroad down to 9,230 feet. But the key was to get there, to get to the bottom of the pass. And the only way you could do that was to take the 50-mile stretch, divide it by the altitude gain of a little more than 4,000 feet, and make a perfect 2% grade all the way. They used a natural ramp going up the Leiden escarpment, up by Leiden Rock, and then winding around these Big Ten curves so that they could get into Coal Creek Canyon and go across the Flatirons formations that are just a little bit south of the town of Boulder. And then at the apex of El Dorado Mountain, they could take a left-hand turn through tunnel number 8 and dive straight into the heart of the Rockies. The key was getting from 5,280 feet in Denver to the 7,000 feet at tunnel number 1 and do it in just 5 miles. So by adding the extra 2.5 miles of the Big Ten Curve, they could do it. And that's what we're looking at here. It's one of the most stunning pieces of engineering ever constructed in Colorado railroading and American railroading for that matter.
I hope I can have Brad on the channel here as a guest someday, as I found his knowledge and passion about railroad history very intriguing. After visiting with Brad, we went up to the Moffett Tunnel East Portal to catch the eastbound Zephyr. We finished that train chase by catching the Zephyr at a grade crossing just west of the Big Ten Curve. Thanks for another fantastic day of chasing trains, Michelle. This is turning into a tradition that's well worth having. Chasing trains with you in your region. I can't wait to do it again. On the 24th, we drove south to Durango, where we'd be staying for the next 3 days. We took the scenic route that went through Alamosa and then to Antonito. I had a chance to see the Glenbrook, visiting from Carson City, and the Eureka, visiting from Las Vegas, and caught up briefly with Stothy Pappas there. And we poked around the yard a little before driving out along the line to catch a couple of trains that were returning from their excursions. The Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad was having a week-long event called the Victorian Iron Horse Roundup that featured the 2 locomotives I just mentioned. And we had time that day, so it was cool to go a little out of the way to experience that end of the Cumbres and Toltec line. We went to the other end of their line as well, but I'll get to that in a minute. We ended the day by finishing the trip to Durango. On the 25th, we went out first thing to catch the Durango and Silverton Narrow Gauge Railroad in action. The Slim Princess, that's Southern Pacific number 18, was leading a double header that we chased all the way to Silverton. We had to interrupt our chase so that we could get back to Durango and tour the Soundtraxx office where they make DCC decoders. I documented this for a program that will come out sometime in the near future. Our friends from the Bay Area, Trevor, Paul, and Lauren, showed up at Soundtraxx as I was wrapping up the video shoot, and they got a quick tour on their own. We all went to dinner at a place in town there with George Bogatuk, and then went to George's house to check out his layout. I've seen his layout on camera dozens of times because we've recorded a lot of Soundtraxx soundbite segments in front of it. It's a nicely detailed HO scale shelf layout, and he has managed to fit a lot of cool operational interest on it. The next day, we rode the Cascade Canyon train with Trevor, Paul, and Lauren. The ride went out to Cascade Canyon and back to Durango. I have to say that the Durango and Silverton has a lot of very dramatic scenery, and I highly recommend riding it if you ever get the chance. I know for sure that I'll return someday to do just that. After the ride, we had an informal shop tour of the DNS shops, thanks to Trevor arranging it with Scott Kennedy, who works there. Alvin, Gary, and I ended up having pizza with George that evening, and then met the others at a local model railroader named Mike May's house to check out his layout. Mike is a super cool guy, and his layout represents the White Pass in Yukon. Mike was another interesting person I'd like to have on the channel someday to talk about the use of stage lighting and other very interesting technology on his layout. If you happen to see this, Mike, thanks very much for sharing your layout with us. Also, thanks to Trevor for inviting us to see it when he went. I love getting a chance to see things like this, things that you don't see every day. You know, that's one of my favorite things here on the channel. Whenever I get back to Durango, I would love to do a layout tour of Mike's layout. I don't know if George would want to do one on his layout, but I think his layout is also worth sharing here on the channel. On Friday, we chased the morning trains with Trevor, Paul, and Lauren before driving out to Chama, New Mexico to see the trains that were part of the Victorian Iron Horse Roundup event that I mentioned a minute ago that the Cumbres and Toltec was putting on all during that week. While we were out that afternoon, we bumped into Mike Armstrong. That's Coaster Fan 2105 here on YouTube. I hadn't seen Mike in a few years, so it was really great to catch up with him. Also, his dad was with him. We caught a few shots and then headed to Pagosa Springs, where we were staying. Paul went with us, but Trevor and Lauren were staying in Chama, so we said goodnight and made plans to meet up the next day. On Saturday, we met up at Chama first thing in the morning. While there, we ran into more train crew members, Dave Adams and CJ Vargas. Dave was riding the train, and CJ had his own train chasing crew, so we didn't get to hang out much with them. The rest of that day was spent out on the line chasing the trains they had running. We ran into Mike and his dad again and got more good shots. The excursion was cut short when the Eureka developed a mechanical problem, so we cut our chase short about 2 p.m. Trevor, Paul, and Lauren were flying back to the Bay Area that day, so they had to leave anyway. Gary, Alvin, and I were pretty burned out, so we welcomed the chance to get back to Pagosa Springs and turn in early. The next day, we hit the road early and covered some 700 plus miles, all the way out to Mojave via Flagstaff, Arizona, where we took a brief rest stop to eat lunch, catch an eastbound stack train, and bombed the virtual railfan camera. We stayed overnight at a Motel 6 in Mojave, something I don't recommend to anyone. Then we got up early to film the UP Mojave sub the next day. Monday is known as Maintenance Day, but we lucked out, catching a few trains in Mojave and then up and down the entire length from Bakersfield to Mojave. A highlight of this day was going to check out the new viewing platform over Tehachapi Loop. I have to tell you, the spot on the hill that I've hiked up to in the past is a much better vantage point than the official viewing platform. You can't even see the tunnel from this official platform. In any case, it was most excellent to get to share that line with Alvin because he'd never seen it before. We stayed in Tehachapi that night after a long day of chasing trains, capped off with some legit pizza from a local pizza place that we took to go, and then ate on the depot platform. And yes, we did see another train while we ate our pizza. On Tuesday, we drove back to Sacramento. I drove home and Alvin flew back to Salt Lake City that evening. I think I have enough video footage for half a dozen Chasing Trains episodes, 2 layout tours, the Soundtraxx office, and a ton of other material that I can make a few more programs out of. I might even be set through the end of the year with what I already have in the schedule. I have to thank both Gary and Alvin for a great trip. We had a ton of laughs about things I won't mention here simply because there's way too much to talk about. So thanks a lot, guys. I don't think we'll ever do a trip that long again, but I am looking forward to something a bit shorter for sure in the future. So that brings us up to date as far as what I've been up to. I don't have any specific viewer comments this month, but I do want to mention that the comments section for the Boston and Albany layout tour with Chuck Araftik video has been extremely active with tons of compliments. As a matter of fact, that video has had more views and comments on it in the first 3 weeks, I think, than any other layout tour that I've published to the channel. Over 40,000 views and something like 190 or 200 comments. If you haven't had a chance to watch that one, take a look. It's one of the prettiest layouts I've had the privilege to document. The most recent episode of Model Railroading with Jack Burgess that came out last weekend also has a lot of comments. Don't take my word for it though, watch it for yourself. And now for this month's Catch of the Month segment. Before I get to the photo catches, I want to mention that I received this box just prior to leaving on my big trip. This is from Nathan DeLay, and I'm planning to open it live during the call-in show with Michelle later this month. So don't forget to tune into that. Now on to the photos. Our first catch comes from Fran Foley, who took this photo in Germany. Note the offset pantographs. That's something you don't see every day. Next up are a couple shots of TSG Train Crew member Larry Grant, who went out with his Chasing Trains crew to watch the big boy in Texas. You're looking good with that stylish shirt, Larry, and your crew looks like they're having fun as well. That's really what it's all about. Sean Koga sent in some photos of his ongoing E6 Power Consist project. He said he remotored one of the units and still has some detail parts to add, as well as Tsunami 2 decoders. Looks like the project is coming right along, Sean. The next shot comes from Jacob Wright, who grabbed this photo on July 29th. Pictured is UP number 5683 heading east near Hood River, Oregon. Since we're talking about catches, I thought I'd share a couple from my recent trip as well. This shot is a frame grab off my iPhone SE that takes 4K video. It's of a BNSF freight train going past the high and wide detector just west of Monolith on the Mojave sub near Tehachapi. This is a shot of Durango and Silverton number 480 chugging past the gourmet market as it heads east out of town. If you have a catch you'd like to share, please email it to podcast@tsgmultimedia.com. Be sure you own the photo and let me know the what's, whens, and wheres of the shots you want to share. Anyway, now for this month's program schedule. Next Friday, that's September 10th, we have a product spotlight. On Saturday the 11th, it's our next layout tour. This time we'll have a look at an HO scale depiction of Donner Pass. Then on September 15th at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, I'll be joined by my co-host Michelle Kempema for our next live call-in talk show. On September 17th, it's the return of Chasing Trains with part 1 of our epic road trip. And then on the 24th, we have another product spotlight. Finally, on September 25th, I have a program about Robin Gilstrom's N-Scale McKean car. I can't wait to share this one with you because it's one of those things you just don't see every day. Alright, I want to share a list of the TSG Train Crew members who support the work I do here. We reached 100 supporters on Patreon this past month, which is a real big deal. Thank you so much to everyone on the Train Crew. All Train Crew members enjoy early 4K ultra high definition and ad-free access to the featured Saturday programs, usually weeks before these programs get published to this channel. I always like to acknowledge the Patreon supporters for helping me bring you the content you enjoy. If you can spare $2 a month or more, you're also invited to join the crew by visiting patreon.com/TSG Multimedia. That's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.